Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of the Business as Usual podcast. This week, we're going to go with probably the biggest business news story of the last 10 years, maybe in the UK. We're going to look at Thomas Cook. It seems like it's really the only story dominating the business news this week. And I think it's one that's worth devoting a whole podcast to. So we've got a few different things we're going to go through. We're going to have a little bit of a look at why they failed and what actually has happened this week. You'll all have heard about it. I imagine that on Monday morning, every single business teacher in the country was talking about it. So we'll have a little why they failed, the impact, whether they should have been saved, and then what actually happens next, whether that's for Thomas Cook. I don't know if there's many options for Thomas Cook, but for the market in general. So Mike and I are going to have a chat through this. We'll see how long. We'll try and aim for about 20, 30 minutes or so, give you something quick and easy to digest. I'm sure this is a story that's going to be talked about for the next few weeks. So without further ado, let's get started. So we all woke up on Monday morning, business teachers and business students all across the country went into school and saw the headlines. Thomas Cook collapses as last-ditch rescue talks fail. Now, it wasn't a huge surprise because it's been talked about for a while and they've been trying to save the company for quite a while. But it was a little bit of a surprise on Monday morning to find out that they hadn't been rescued. So for a bit of background, Thomas Cook, obviously the travel agents, holiday firm, they have a bunch of different types of parts of their operation. It's not just airplanes. They have all the hotel resorts and so on and so forth. They've been going for 178 years, so it was the longest established UK based travel agent. And on Monday morning, the Civil Aviation Authority, so it's a regulatory body for that industry, said that they had ceased operating with immediate effect. And what basically that meant is 150,000 people who were on holiday abroad from Britain were stuck. Now, most of those, if their holiday's finished, will have come back by now. But massive operation to try and get everyone back, and a lot of things going into that. They had actually secured a rescue deal over the weekend. It was a £900 million rescue deal, and it was by their largest shareholder, which is a Chinese company called Fosun. That deal had been agreed in August, but the banks wanted an additional 200 million in contingency funding, and that was what they couldn't get. And they reached a point over the weekend where they realised that they weren't going to be able to reach that agreement. They weren't going to be able to keep the company going. So they went into what we call compulsory liquidation. So liquidation is a topic that gets covered certainly in A-level business, where effectively it's about the value of assets and how easy it is for a company to raise cash. That tends to be what the current ratio and asset test ratio calculations are for. Compulsory liquidation is obviously where that's forced upon a business. So it'll mean that the assets that Thomas Cook does own will be sold. So that's what's happened this week. Most of that happened on Monday. What we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of a look back at what the problems were over the last few decades, but in particular over the last sort of 12, 13 years. So, Mike, do you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we should start off with the social trends that they just haven't kept up to date with. I mean, they were well known, weren't they, for their holidays to mainland Europe. They built up around Turkey, the Canary Islands, and their 18 to 30s were big, which they tried to sell off, didn't they, about a year or two ago. But they've seen that slump. They've seen demand for those go downhill. They tried to readjust with the new CEO, Frank Hauser. I think it was 3 years ago now. So he tried to turn it around. He couldn't sell off the bits of the business that weren't profitable, and he just couldn't turn the tide. I mean, it's been coming for years and decades, we could say. So I mean, the social trends of people not wanting to book package holidays, which kind of goes against what most trends we talk about with businesses. I mean, if we look at Netflix, Amazon, etc., all of that was we want it quick, easy now. But it seems we've gone the other way with the holiday industry, and we like to fuss and pick individual plane journeys and hotels down to the whether we want to get a taxi or a bus from the airport to the hotel. So it's quite an interesting one, really.
Yeah, I think one quote I read earlier this week was from a guy called Simon Calder, who's a travel expert, and his quote was about why Thomas Cook have failed, and one of the biggest reasons was he said everyone now can pretend they're a travel agent. So the need for a travel agent is just almost non-existent, really. And there's loads of businesses that have come up over the last 10 years. I mean, you can book a holiday on your phone, can't you? We on holiday in Prague this summer, we booked an entire holiday to New York for February for my birthday. We did it in about half an hour on our phone, just like that. You don't need to go into a travel agent. You can do all of these things yourself. Websites like Airbnb, Ryanair, and EasyJet were obviously online only. They've benefited from that. They're just making it easy and cheap for consumers who they're not hassled with going into town and thinking, right, okay, on Saturday we're going to go into Thomas Cook and we're going to sort a holiday out for the summer. And I read another statistic that said 1 in 7 people are going into the high street branches, people who are looking for a holiday. And that is mainly the older generation. So the majority of those are over 55s.
I heard it was even fewer than that. I heard it was 1 in 10 nearly.
Right.
So like, obviously you get different reports on data like that. But I mean, just not enough. I mean, they did start closing them down, but just not quick enough. But I mean, I wouldn't say that was their main downfall. I mean, whilst it does cost a lot to run those stores, it's a small amount compared to the amount of debt they've racked up over the years.
Yeah. Well, they nearly failed in the early 2010s, didn't they? There was a massive issue in 2007. 2007, they had that 1.5 billion loss that they've obviously announced this last year. They've sort of attributed 1 billion of that to the failed merger from in 2007 with MyTravel, which you might not have heard of, but you might have heard of Airtours or Going Places, which were the two sort of main parts of MyTravel. That was supposed to save them 75 million a year on costs, sort of duplicated costs, and it hasn't. It's ended up costing them 1 billion, and if their debts now are 1.5 billion and they're writing off about 2/3 of that to this merger, it just goes to show that decision that was taken 12 years ago, how much of an impact that's had.
Yeah, I mean, following that, they had to do a rights issue to plug that hole back after that merger, takeover merger. Yeah, I mean, they did a rights issue, I think, of 450 million from existing shareholders. So, I mean, that saved them back then. But, I mean, it was just a short-term measure, weren't it? And they've slowly racked up the debt.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because I recall, I mean, I've been teaching 7 years now, so around about the time 2012, I remember the first couple of years of my teaching career, everyone was talking about Harriet Green, who was the CEO of Thomas Cook in 2011 and 2012, about how she'd been this sort of heroic figure who'd come in and saved Thomas Cook. And actually now you look at it several years on, and although she managed to rescue their share price, it clearly hasn't future-proofed the business, because a few years later they're just in even more trouble than they were in then. I looked at some of the finances. It was on the BBC article, which we'll put in the description. They've had losses each winter since 2007, and eventually those losses have ended up becoming more than the profits they were actually making in the summer. And they had an 18 months of losses straight in 2011, 2012, which is what then prompted Harriet Green to be appointed as CEO. And then that all sort of looks fairly similar. The losses are piling up a little bit, but 2019 in particular, that 1.5 billion loss has obviously been the final knife in the chest, basically, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit misleading. I mean, a lot of people and a lot of students will think that was obviously one bad year. But I mean, that was two big things, weren't it? I mean, you mentioned it already, the 1 billion or 1.1 billion asset write-off of the takeover. And then they also had the fact that a lot of their assets were under the intangible heading under brand value. And they had accountants essentially come in, I think it was Standard & Poor's come in and say essentially that they had overvalued it and it wasn't prudent. So they'd said, Thomas Cook brand was almost worthless. So they had to write that down as well. So that comes to a cool 1.5 billion odd. Yeah,
do you want to explain? I think there'll be quite a few students who won't understand what that sort of intangible assets and the brand value and how that actually shows up on a balance sheet.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, if we talk about brand, don't we think of Nike, and the reason you buy Nike over, say, Adidas, because they have a stronger brand, even at the same price and same quality. So what we do is we say that has some value because it takes you a long time to build that up. So if we was going to sell the company, you wouldn't just be selling Nike as a trainer manufacturer and a a clothes manufacturer, you'll be selling that company and the brand that goes with that. Because if you're starting up a new company, it'd take you forever to even try and compete with Nike. So they put some monetary value to that. It's a bit of a tricky one, because a lot of accountants will try and overvalue a brand for a company because it makes them look in a much more secure position. So, I mean, if I was ever buying shares in a company, that is one thing I'd look very carefully at, how much they're attributing to their brand value. But I mean, even experts can't tell whether they've overvalued a brand's worth or not. So it's very, very tricky.
Very sort of subjective, isn't it? Yeah, very subjective. So we've got a few reasons why Thomas Cook have been in trouble. Obviously, those financial, the basic loss of assets there through their brand and through the written off assets with the failed merger. We've mentioned trends and people booking their holidays themselves. I think a few of the things that are worth mentioning are Thomas Cook's kind of built itself around package breaks and beach holidays. And if you look at the trends in holidays, which a lot of business students and business teachers have over the last few years, because it was on one of the A-level pre-release subjects last year, the trends say that people are having more city breaks than any other type of holiday. And Thomas Cook's package deals don't really work to that market quite so well, whereas Airbnb is obviously a game changer in that side of the market, but also people who are going on city breaks, it tends to be they just want a cheap weekend away. They want to keep the costs to a minimum. They just want to go somewhere nice, stay somewhere nice. And so they're booking an Airbnb, they're booking a Ryanair flight, an EasyJet flight. I've done it 3 times over the last 18 months. So at no point have I even considered Thomas Cook. It's always been Airbnb, and then let's see what cheap flights we can get that are at a decent time. So that combination of trends in the holiday market and the availability of online businesses has had a massive impact. There's been a few other things as well. Obviously, last summer's heat wave didn't help. A lot of people decided not to take holidays because the weather was actually pretty good here for a change. Not in the northeast, I don't imagine, but everywhere else in the country it was okay. But it clearly wasn't something they planned for. They were still paying dividends out to shareholders in November. And given the situation that they'd been in for the previous few years, you'd think that they'd be a bit more proactive in recognizing that they couldn't afford to pay those shareholders, and that money should have been used to try and keep the business going, I suppose.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that. I wrote an exam paper, as an extra mock, just because there weren't many papers for the A-level, and I did one round Thomas Cook, and I made the 20-mark question: should they pay out dividends or should they cancel them? Like Centrica are starting to talk about doing. But I mean, it's tricky because if you do cancel or drop dividends, then shareholders take their money elsewhere.
Yeah.
And then it
becomes very difficult to get future investment, doesn't it?
Exactly. And then the company's value goes down, and then it's harder for you to secure more lending, because your lending will go against the assets of the business, which is the value of the company. So it's tricky. It's a vicious circle. If you don't give out dividends, we then don't get the ability investment. We don't get the ability to borrow. So I mean, I do have some sympathy from that kind of point of view. But I get what you're saying.
That's the point of a dividend, isn't it? It's to reward investment, but to also encourage more investment. I mean, if you're not rewarding your shareholders who've put money into the company, the majority of the time it's to make money. If you're not rewarding that, then they're not going to put their money in again. And so, but obviously from a PR perspective, it's a bit of a bad look, isn't it? Because there's, I think, something like 9,000 Thomas Cook employees in the UK and countless more who've had holidays cancelled. And so when they read that the shareholders, the millionaire shareholders, have received a dividend as recently as sort of 10 months ago, it does reflect poorly on the sort of financial management. But then that's why it's a good 20 marker, because there's an argument either way, isn't there? Yeah,
I mean, I think they said, looking at the knock-on effect, I think it's about 21,000 employees and subsidiaries that will get hit. So it's a big one, which is, I guess, why we will talk about later on whether they should have been saved or not. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
Yeah, so I think that covers probably 2 areas, really, doesn't it? Why they failed, and then the impact. I think the obvious immediate impact on Thomas Cook themselves is that business is no longer operating. There's 150,000 holidaymakers who were stuck abroad. 9,000 members of staff have lost their jobs. It's had an impact on a few other areas as well, which we'll talk about when we ask what happens next. But let's go to that question. should they have been saved? Should they have been bailed out by government potentially, or any other sort of source?
I mean, it's tricky. I mean, I was talking about this earlier. I mean, they were nationalised in the 40s because they were in trouble. I think it's 48, something like that. They got nationalised back then because they were in trouble, and they got merged essentially with the management of National Rail, wasn't it? Network Rail, yeah. So, I mean, should we have done it again? I would say no, because whilst I see the value in the company, a British brand, etc., and the number of jobs lost, it's a business doomed to fail, isn't it? I would say. They were saved with a rights issue. They were saved through nationalisation. I mean, I know it was 70 odd years ago, but they're just in a hole. And Frank Hauser, their CEO, hasn't found a way, in my opinion, to prove they're on the right track. And it would just be a little bit of propping up they would need. So I agree with letting them go to the wall.
No, I think I probably do agree. Actually, they try to sell off the more sort of valuable, the loss-making assets. But the difficult thing with selling off a loss-making asset is it's a loss-making asset, and I mean their cost. I think they've got over 500 outlets across the UK, and they're not going to get more popular. I don't think there's anything you can do in that market to encourage people to go into branch. And obviously, as your costs are incurred through having that, you're just going to end up having to, whether that has a massive impact on prices, I'm not sure. But I don't see any way they would have been able, without writing off the debt and letting them start again, which is a terrible message to send to business. I don't see how you would rescue that situation. But I do think that I agree. And I think when you look around the market and other businesses that are struggling in a similar way, like TUI, for example, which is one of the biggest competitors to Thomas Cook, they're also struggling. They've had, I think, 3 profit warnings in 2019. The difference between them and Thomas Cook is they've just got less debt. So they're going to be able to ride that out and have a bit more of a chance to sort of put it right. Whereas I read another statistic which I thought was really interesting. Since 2011, Thomas Cook have paid out 1.2 billion just on interest on debt, which is about more than a quarter of their revenue. So that's after that rights issue. I think the rights issue was 2011, wasn't it?
Yeah, something like that, yeah. So
if more than a quarter of the money that's coming in is just paying off interest, you're not actually paying off the debt balance, you're just paying off the interest on it. How are you going to be able to ever actually pay off that debt to a state where you're actually able to then invest in moving forward and growing? And the way the market trends have gone, they really, really struggled. TUI is probably a company that's going to be looking over their shoulder and hoping to turn this into a bit of a positive. They might find that they go the same way. They might, on the other hand, find that they benefit from Thomas Cook's collapse by taking some of those customers who are looking for that.
When you say TUI, do you mean Jet2?
Is that the same?
Jet2 is the company that's looking to take over a lot of their routes in the airports, and is they're doing a recruitment fair.
TUI as in the competitor, so the TUI group, which is like
the
Thomson.
German
Thomson,
company.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's Jet2 that's looking apparently to take over their routes and their
I didn't mean in terms of take over their assets. I meant sort of just competition wise. They're pretty much the closest to Thomas Cook that we've got in terms of like as a company and how they operate with the sort of in branch travel agents and the more traditional sort of travel agent approach.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean Jet2 is meant to be the new up and coming, isn't it, that everyone uses these days? But I mean, they're even looking in trouble as well. So it's a tricky old industry to be in.
Well, it seems like it's very much split, doesn't it? You've got the travel agents, the old traditional travel agents, and then you've got the online e-commerce businesses. So I guess the next question then is what happens. It's probably the last question actually, is what happens next. I think for Thomas Cook, there isn't really a huge amount to say, but the collapse of Thomas Cook does have huge ramifications on the rest of the industry. And that's not just competitors. That's the sort of businesses that supply them as well, so and businesses that work with them in different markets. So we've mentioned Jet2 and TUI, who are potentially in a little bit of trouble, but also potentially looking to capitalize on this and increase their sales, because a lot of holiday makers who were with Thomas Cook, it was obviously a big company, will have to find somewhere else. But there's quite a big impact on airports as well, isn't there? I think Mike, you've had a few airports that you think might be in a bit of trouble because they were heavily sort of supplied by Thomas Cook.
Yeah, they were saying on the news this morning that all the London airports, Birmingham, Glasgow, etc., will be fine, but the likes of Newcastle, the East Midlands Airport, and Cardiff are all gonna lose a big percentage of their traffic, essentially, with not very popular destinations just being left with the likes of Ryanair and Jet2 not very interested. So it looks like Newcastle, East Midlands, and Cardiff airports are going to struggle, might have to lay people off, etc.
So what are their options then? I mean, obviously they're going to try and sort of sell those landing spots to other airlines.
I would imagine the likes of Newcastle, etc., will try more routes with Scandinavian countries. I'd imagine there seems to be a bit of an uptick in demand from there. It'll be a mad scramble essentially for the airports to try and encourage them to put a route in that airport. I mean, it's going to be essentially like you trying to get business into your country from an economic point of view. It's going to be a sales pitch. Probably, I'd imagine they're going to give them subsidies, free rent, etc., to get them in to start with. That's what I would do if I were them. But it'd be interesting to see if they can sort it out. I imagine job losses in the airports, baggage handlers, etc., will be a given, at least in the short term.
I guess that's probably one of the arguments about the question of whether they should they have been saved. Is it's not just the 9,000 people within Thomas Cook that potentially lose their job. It's the impact that it has on the industry as a whole, and the businesses that are taking advantage of the e-commerce, the likes of Airbnb, Ryanair, and EasyJet. In terms of employment, they actually contribute significantly less than a lot of the businesses that have the more traditional sort of bricks and mortar travel agents and so on. And obviously, that's going to have a big impact following on. So I think although the Thomas Cook story appears to be over, the sort of overarching story about airlines and the airline industry and the travel industry is going to have probably a difficult few years.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's going to have an impact on countries even outside of the UK, isn't it? I mean, Thomas Cook were trendsetters for setting the flights, the routes back live for Turkey, Egypt, Tunisia, following all the terrorist attacks. So, I mean, those three countries are heavily reliant on our tourism, and I'm not sure the other airlines are going to pick those up. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you're going to see GDP possibly of Egypt, Tunisia, Turkey hit from an economic point of view, and job losses there. I mean, even on the news, we were talking about suppliers, weren't you, to the business. The hotels, it's quite an interesting discussion. The hotels are struggling, aren't they? I mean, I saw they locked in some and demanded payment because Thomas Cook don't pay for months after their visit. So they know they're not going to see that. So they was going to try and recoup that. So we could see hotels going bust as a result of this as well.
I guess that's probably the last thing to sort of end on is the impact that it had on consumers. So there were 150,000 were stuck abroad, and they will all get home, and they'll all be compensated. And anyone who has a booking with Thomas Cook will be compensated because of ATOL. If you don't know what ATOL is, you probably heard about it quite a lot this week. ATOL is the Air Travel Organizer license scheme. So they'll pay to cover the accommodation and the flights home. Effectively, it's almost like an insurance, basically. But that protection means that if something happens to the company that you're booking your holiday with, you're protected, obviously, with something that it's not your fault. But businesses tend not to pay for these things up front. So there was a lot of angry hotels where they've got people in those hotels that they're spending money on keeping and feeding and so on, knowing that now they're not going to get their money. So it's been quite an ugly week, really. I think there was a couple in countries where they were locked in with armed guard, weren't they?
Yeah.
Which is not an ideal way to spend your holiday. But thankfully they'll all be compensated. The big problem that I've seen a lot of, and this is just Facebook sort of sensationalism, but I've seen a lot of people on Facebook saying that holiday prices have shot up since Thomas Cook's collapse. Similar holidays that might have cost sort of £500 the week before are now costing sort of 3 times that. So there's also an argument that the companies are capitalizing on people who already maybe booked time off work and had already planned to have a holiday and had the money spare and will receive the money back. People trying to capitalize on that by trying to hike up the prices a little bit.
Yeah, they have. I mean, it's a tricky one because, I mean, I'll have to explain this. I mean, to Ryanair and EasyJet and all that, they use an algorithm, a bit like, like YouTube, what comes up first on YouTube, Google, etc. So they put in a set, how much supply there is in the market, how much demand there is in the market, and then their prices auto-generate based off that. So, I mean, the fact that all the supply from Thomas Cook has just been deleted, essentially, removed from the market, that is what has made the pricing go up to that amount. I mean, I was looking to go away in the half term for a week, and just the flight on its own shot up from £120 to 400. And we can blame the companies for that, but I mean, it's just literally supply and demand. So I just won't be going on holiday this half term.
Yeah, I'm glad I booked mine in this. I'm glad I booked mine in the summer.
God damn.
All right. Well, on that positive note, I think we'll wrap up. Thanks for listening. Please do subscribe. You can catch this on Spotify and on YouTube. We're probably going to do a few extra little bits. So I think Mike's going to put together a bit of a Kahoot quiz on some other business news stories from this last week. I'm going to put together a little bit of maybe just like a short answer quiz that I'm going to give to my students. Basically, just check they've listened. So I'm just going to write out a couple of questions that were answered in this podcast. Just sort of simple, one phrase answers kind of thing. And we'll share that as well, so that you can check whether your students are paying attention and whether they're listening to it. Mine haven't got a choice, because I'm making them listen to it. But other teachers might want to do something similar as well. So thanks for listening, Mike. Thanks for joining us on your Saturday evening.
Of course, pleasure as usual.
Yeah, no Arsenal game today, so would today play?
On Monday.
Yeah,
I'm suffering on Monday. Old Trafford.
Newcastle don't lose until tomorrow, so that explains why we're both in a decent mood. All right, thank you very much. I'll speak to you next time.